Good morning. Today is the 28th day of December 2016. And we continue with our series, Seeking the New Poetry. And today we introduce the poet Edward Carpenter. Much has been written about Carpenter, his life, his lifestyle, and his social consciousness. So much of it is available on the internet. For Whitman and Carpenter are often mentioned together for their groundbreaking attempts at a new poetry. And Carpenter was an admitted disciple of Whitman. The Times Literary Supplement wrote that his work, quote, was written from some predominant mood or consciousness superseding the purely intellectual. Working for a new social order, Carpenter felt that life is ever good, and if one could go beneath the surface to find one's true self, he would realize this essential fact. Our series, Seeking the New Poetry, concentrates not on the person, but his poetry. And we cite those examples given by Sri Aurobindo in his unsurpassed volume, The Future Poetry, in which he mentions Carpenter a number of times. Following this introduction, we will read a series of poems by Carpenter. In praising the small book, New Ways in English Literature, by Mr. James Cousins, Sri Aurobindo speaks of vers libre, as exemplified in Whitman and Carpenter. Here are some passages. Sri Aurobindo writes of Cousins' book, but still the book deals among contemporary poets with Tagore, A.E., and Yeats, among recent poets with Stephen Phillips, Meredith, Carpenter, great names, all of them, not to speak of lesser writers. Sri Aurobindo continues in another passage, quote, nevertheless, meter, by which we mean a fixed and balanced system of the measures of sound, mantra, is not only the traditional, but also surely the right physical basis for the poetic movement. A recent modern tendency, that which has given us the poetry of Whitman and Carpenter, and the experimentalists in vers libre in France and Italy, denies this tradition and sets aside meter as a limiting bondage, perhaps even a frivolous artificiality or a falsification of true, free, and natural poetic rhythm. That is, it seems to me, a point of view which cannot eventually prevail, because it does not deserve to prevail. It certainly cannot triumph unless it justifies itself by supreme rhythmical achievements, besides which the highest work of the great masters of poetic harmony in the past shall sink into a clear inferiority. That has not yet been done. On the contrary, Vers Libre has done its best when it has either limited its aim in rhythm to a kind of chanting poetical prose, or else based itself on a sort of irregular and complex metrical movement, which in its inner law, though not in its form, recalls the idea of Greek choric poetry. Why not then break away from all the old hampering restrictions and find a new principle of harmony in accordance with the freedom, the breadth and largeness of view, the fineness of feeling and sensation of the modern spirit, some form which shall have the liberty of prose and yet command the intensified heights and fluctuations and falls of the cadence of poetry? There is no reason why not, if the thing can be done. The proof of these things lies in the execution. But it may be doubted whether the method used is the right method. At any rate, it has not been fully justified, even in the hands of its greatest or most skillful exponents. It is used, as in Whitman, to give the roll of the sea of life, or the broad and varying movements of the spirit of humanity in its vigorous experience and aspiration, or, as in Carpenter, to arrive at the free and harmonious accession of the human intelligence to profound, large, and powerful truths of the Spirit. And later in this chapter on the free verse, Sri Aurobindo writes, we may get some idea of the limitations of the form by one or two examples from the poetry of Carpenter, I find quoted by Mr. Cousins in his essay. Carpenter, with a poetic faculty of a high order, a prophet of democracy and of the self, like Whitman, but of a higher, more spiritual truth of the self, has, like him, found it impossible to restrain the largeness of his vision and personality in the bonds of metrical poetry. In both, we see that the prophet and thinker predominate over the poet and artist. Less rough and great than the epic voice from the other side of the ocean, his poetry has a more harmonious, limpid, and meditative fullness. But the lesser abundance of force and drive makes us feel more the limitations of his form. The thought is not only great, but poetically great and satisfying. The expression as form of thought is noble and admirable, but we miss the subtler rhythmic uplift of the poetic enthusiasm which is given to minds of much less power by the inspiring cadence and the ordered measures of the poetic spirit, chandas. His flow is ordinarily of the middle kind, with occasional choric turns and movements, but the latter do not carry with them the full force of the intenser poetic cadence. To cite one passage, quote, "There, in the region of equality, in the world of freedom no longer limited, standing on a lofty peak in heaven above the clouds, from below hidden, yet to all who pass into that region most clearly visible, he, the Eternal, appeared." End quote. Sri Aurobindo continues, "There are two elevations rising up from a rhythmical prose cadence, but lifted high by the scriptural nobility of phrase and spiritual turn, which we get so often in Carpenter. But a demand is there, and it indicates a real need. It is evident that Whitman and Carpenter could not have expressed themselves altogether in the existing forms, even if they had made the attempt. The poets of yesterday and today, Whitman, Carpenter, the Irish poets, Tagore, but also others in their degree, are forerunners of this new spirit and way of seeing, prophets sometimes, but at others only illumined by occasional hints or by side rays of a light which has not flooded all their vision. Again, in another paragraph, quote, "A first opening out to this new way of seeing is the sense of the work of Whitman and Carpenter and some of the French poets, of Tagore and Yeats and A.E., of Meredith and some others of the English poets. There are critics who regard this tendency as only another sign of decadence. They see in it a morbid brilliance, a phosphorescence of decay, or the phosphorescence which we observe on the sea when the sun has gone down and night occupies the waters. But this is to suppose that poetry can only repeat what it has done in the past and can accomplish no new and great thing, and that a clear, strong, or brilliant dealing with the outer mind and world is its last word, and the one condition of its healthy creativeness. There is much that is morbid, perverse, or unsound in some recent poetry. But this comes from an artificial prolongation of the past, or a temporary mixed straining. It does not belong to that element in the new poetry which escapes from it and turns firmly to the things of the future. A glint of this change is already visible. And in poetry, there is already the commencement of such a greater leading, the conscious effort of Whitman, the tone of Carpenter, the significance of the poetry of A.E., the rapid, immediate fame of Tagore are its first signs. The idea of the poet who is also the rishi has made again its appearance. This need is the sufficient reason for attaching the greatest importance to those poets in whom there is the double seeking of this twofold power, the truth and reality of the eternal self and spirit in man and things, and the insistence on life. All the most significant and vital work in recent poetry has borne this stamp. The rest is of the hour, but this is of the future. It is the highest note of Whitman. In him, as in one who seeks and sees much, but has not fully found, it widens the sweep of a great pioneer poetry, but is an opening of a new view rather than a living in its accomplished fullness. It is constantly repeated from the earth side in Meredith, comes down from the spiritual side in all A.E.'s work, moves between earth and the life of the worlds behind in Yeats' subtle rhythmic voices of vision and beauty, echoes with a large fullness in Carpenter. The note, which has already begun and found many of its tones in Whitman and Carpenter and A.E. and Tagore, will grow into a more full and near and intimate poetic knowledge and vision and feeling, which will continue to embrace more and more, no longer only the more exceptional inner states and touches, which are the domain of mystic poetry, but everything in our inner and outer existence, until all life and experience has been brought within the mold of the spiritual sense and the spiritual interpretation. A poetry of this kind will be in a supreme way what all art should be, a thing of harmony and joy and illumination, a solution and release of the soul from its vital unrest and questioning and struggle, not by any ignoring of these things, but by an uplifting into the strength of the self within and the light and air of its greater view, where there is found not only the point of escape, but the supporting calmness and power of a seated knowledge, mastery, and deliverance.